My sister-in-law Rachel looked me straight in the eye and said my son wasn't welcome at her wedding anymore. She claimed he was too disruptive, too much of a distraction for such an important day. But what she didn't know was that I had the bank, statements in my purse, the receipts that showed exactly who had been funding her dream wedding all along. When David walked through those church doors anyway, carrying a manila envelope that would change everything, the look on her face was worth every penny I'd secretly spent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The trouble started 3 months before Rachel's wedding to one seems my brother-in-law Mark. I should have seen it coming, really. Rachel had always been the type of person who measured love by convenience, who treated relationships like transactions where she held all the cards. But I never thought she'd go after my son. David was 8 years old, bright as a button, and admittedly energetic in the way that healthy children are. He wasn't a problem child by any stretch of the imagination, just a normal kid who sometimes spoke up during quiet moments or asked innocent questions that adults found inconvenient. But to Rachel, he represented everything she couldn't control about her perfect wedding day. It had been a Tuesday evening when she called me. I was in the middle of helping David with his homework, watching him carefully form his letters on lined paper, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The phone rang, and I saw Rachel's name flash across the screen. I almost didn't answer, something in my gut warning me that this conversation wasn't going to end well. "Hey, Rachel," I said, wedging the phone between my ear and shoulder while I continued checking David's math problems. "Sarah, we need to talk." Her voice was clipped, businesslike in that way that always made my stomach twist. Rachel worked in corporate marketing, and she had this ability to make every conversation sound like a hostile negotiation. "What's going on?" I asked, though I was already bracing myself. "It's about David and the wedding." My hand stilled. On David's worksheet. What about David and the wedding? There was a pause, and I could practically hear her calculating her words, figuring out the most efficient way to deliver whatever blow she was about to land. "Mark and I have been talking, and we've decided that having children at the wedding might be too much of a distraction. You know how David can be, always asking questions, making noise at inappropriate times. This is going to be a very formal affair, and we need everything to go smoothly." The words hit me like cold water. I looked down at David, still hunched over his homework, completely unaware that he was being discussed like a problem to be solved. "Rachel," I said carefully, "David is family. He's been looking forward to this wedding for months. He's been practicing walking slowly because he wants to be respectful during the ceremony. I'm sure he has good intentions, but Sarah, you have to understand. This wedding is costing us $30,000. We can't risk having it disrupted by a child who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation." $30,000. I almost laughed, but the sound would have come out bitter and sharp. If Rachel only knew where that $30,000 had actually come from. If she only knew about the quiet conversations I'd had with Mark, the checks I'd written, the credit card payments I'd made, all because I wanted my brother-in-law to have the wedding of his dreams, even if it meant marrying someone I was increasingly certain didn't deserve him. "He's 8 years old, Rachel. He's not going to ruin your wedding by existing. Look, I'm not trying to be mean about this. I'm just being practical. Maybe David could come to the reception for a little while, after the formal stuff is over. But the ceremony itself needs to be adults only." I felt something hot and protective rise in my chest. This wasn't about practicality. This was about control, about Rachel's need to orchestrate every single detail of her day without having to consider anyone else's feelings. And my son, my sweet, excited little boy who had been talking about wearing his new suit and seeing Uncle Mark get married, was being treated like an inconvenience. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "There's nothing to think about, Sarah. This is what's happening. I'm sorry if it's disappointing. But this is my wedding day, and I get to decide how it goes. Her wedding day. Not Mark's and her wedding day. Not a celebration that brought two families together. Her day, where she got to decide who was worthy of witnessing it. After I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, watching David finish his homework. He was humming softly to himself, some song he'd learned at school, completely content in his little world. How was I supposed to tell him that he wasn't welcome at one of the most important family events of the year? How was I supposed to explain that sometimes adults make decisions that hurt children for no good reason other than their own selfishness? That night, after David was asleep, I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder where I kept all the wedding-related receipts. The catering deposit, the venue payment, the flowers, the photographer, the band, line item after line item of expenses that I had quietly covered because Mark had confided in me months earlier that they were struggling financially. Rachel didn't know. She thought Mark had somehow managed to scrape together enough money for her dream wedding, and I had been happy to let her believe that because I loved my brother-in-law and wanted him to start his marriage without the stress of overwhelming debt. But looking at those receipts now, adding up the thousands of dollars I had spent to make Rachel's perfect day possible, I felt something shift inside me. This woman, who was refusing to let my son attend a wedding that I had essentially paid for, had no idea who she was really dealing with. The next few weeks were tense. I tried talking to Mark, hoping he might be the voice of reason, but he was caught between loyalty to his fiancée and his genuine affection for David. Rachel had clearly gotten to him first, painting David as some kind of wedding-destroying force of chaos rather than a normal child who happened to have energy and curiosity. "She's just stressed about the wedding," Mark told me over coffee one afternoon. "You know how women get about these things." I wanted to point out that I was also a woman, and I had somehow managed to include children in my own wedding without the world ending. But I bit my tongue. This wasn't Mark's fault. Not really. He was trying to keep peace in his relationship, and I understood that impulse, even if I disagreed with his methods. "Mark," I said carefully, "David has been so excited about this. He's been telling everyone at school that his Uncle Mark is getting married and that he gets to wear a special suit." Mark's face softened. He loved David, I knew that. They had a special relationship, the kind of easy friendship that can exist between a man and a child when there's no parental pressure involved. Mark was the uncle who brought unexpected presents, who got down on the floor to play with toy cars, who listened seriously when David explained complicated rules to made-up games. "Maybe we can work something out," he said. Maybe David could come to the ceremony but sit in the back or leave right after. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Rachel had made her decision, and Mark wasn't strong enough to fight her on it. Not when the wedding was 3 weeks away and she was already stressed about 1,000 other details. It was around this time that I started thinking about the manila envelope. Not as revenge exactly, but as insurance, as proof of what this wedding really represented and who had made it possible. I gathered copies of every receipt, every bank statement, every credit card payment that showed my contributions to Rachel and Mark's big day. I organized them chronologically, highlighted the relevant amounts, and put them in a manila envelope that I kept in my purse. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But having that proof, having that tangible evidence of my investment in this wedding, made me feel less powerless in a situation where I was watching my son get pushed aside by someone who had no idea what she was really asking for. 2 weeks before the wedding, Rachel called again. This time, she wasn't even pretending to be diplomatic. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. The decision about David is final. I don't want to have this conversation again. I don't want Mark feeling guilty about it, and I don't want you making this harder than it needs to be. Children don't belong at formal weddings, period." "Plenty of weddings include children, Rachel. Not mine. My wedding is going to be elegant and sophisticated, and that means making some hard choices about who can handle that level of formality." There it was again, her wedding. As if Mark was just an accessory to her perfect day. As if the families being joined together were just background decoration for her starring role. I've already told David he's not coming, I lied. But I want you to know that this decision says more about you than it does about him. I can live with that, she said, and hung up. But I hadn't told David anything yet. I couldn't bring myself to break his heart over something that felt so fundamentally wrong. Instead, I made a different decision. I went shopping. I bought David the most beautiful little suit I could find. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt and a silver tie that made his eyes look even more serious and grown up than usual. I bought him new dress shoes that he spent an hour learning to tie properly. I told him we were getting him ready for Uncle Mark's wedding, and his face lit up with the kind of pure joy that reminded me exactly why I was willing to fight for him. "Do I look like a grown-up, Mom?" he asked, standing in front of the mirror, in his new outfit. "You look perfect," I told him, and meant it. The morning of the wedding, I helped David get dressed carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. I combed his hair with a neat part, the way he liked it for special occasions. I pinned a small boutonniere to his lapel, a tiny white rose that matched the ones the groomsmen would be wearing. He stood still and patient while I fussed with his collar, understanding somehow that this was an important moment. "Are you excited? To see Uncle Mark get married?" I asked him. "Yeah, and I'm going to sit very quietly during the ceremony just like we practiced." We had practiced. Over the past few weeks, while Rachel was busy trying to disinvite him, David and I had spent time talking about wedding etiquette, about when to stand and when to sit, about using quiet voices and paying attention. He was more prepared for this wedding than half the adults who would be there. The church was beautiful when we arrived. Rachel had chosen an old stone building with tall, stained glass windows and wooden pews that gleamed with polish. White roses and babies' breath decorated the altar, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. It was exactly the kind of elegant, traditional setting that she had dreamed of, the kind of backdrop that would make her feel like a princess in her own fairy tale. I had planned to slip in quietly with David, to find seats in the back where we wouldn't draw attention. But as we walked through the church doors, I saw Rachel standing near the entrance in her wedding dress, greeting early guests with the kind of radiant smile that was probably costing her face muscles considerable effort to maintain. Her eyes landed on David first, taking in his perfect little suit and his carefully combed hair. Then her gaze shifted to me, and I watched her expression change from confusion to recognition to something that looked like panic. "Sarah," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What are you doing here?" "We're here for the wedding," I said calmly, "just like we've been planning for months." "I told you David wasn't invited. I made that very clear." David looked up at me, confusion flickering across his face. This was the first time he was hearing that he might not be welcome, and I could see him trying to process what Rachel was saying. "But Mom," he said in that loud whisper that children use when they're trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. "You said we were coming to Uncle Mark's wedding." Rachel's smile became even more strained. There were other guests nearby, family members and friends who were starting to notice the tension in our little group. This was exactly the kind of scene she had been trying to avoid, but her own behavior was creating it. "Perhaps we should discuss this outside," she said through gritted teeth. But I was done being managed by Rachel. I was done pretending that her comfort was more important than my son's feelings. I was done enabling her need to control every aspect of every situation, regardless of who got hurt in the process. I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope. "Actually, Rachel, I think we should discuss this right here. Because there are some things about this wedding that you might want to understand before you start deciding who does and doesn't belong here." her eyes fixed on the envelope with the kind of wariness that people reserve for potentially explosive devices. "What is that?" "Proof," I said simply. "Proof of who actually paid for your dream wedding." The color drained from Rachel's face. Around us, I could feel the attention of other guests shifting in our direction, drawn by the unmistakable tension in Rachel's voice and the envelope in my hand that seemed to represent some kind of threat to her perfect day. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" I opened the envelope and pulled out the first receipt. Catering deposit, $4,000, paid by Sarah Mitchell. I pulled out another. Venue rental, $6,000, paid by Sarah Mitchell. Another. Photography package, $3,000, paid by Sarah Mitchell. With each receipt I named, Rachel's face grew paler. The guests who had been politely pretending not to listen were now openly staring, drawn into a drama that was unfolding right in front of the altar where Rachel was supposed to be getting married in less than an hour. "Stop," she whispered. But I wasn't stopping. Not anymore. I pulled out more receipts, more bank statements, more proof of the secret I had been keeping for months. The flowers, the music, the decorations that were making her wedding look like something out of a magazine. All of it paid for by the woman whose son she had deemed unworthy of witnessing the ceremony. "In total," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the church, "I have personally paid for approximately $22,000 of your $30,000 wedding, which means that my son, the child you decided was too disruptive to attend, has more right to be here than almost anyone else in this building." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood frozen in her wedding dress, surrounded by the flowers I had bought, in the venue I had rented, looking at the guests who were now understanding that the wedding they were attending had been funded by someone other than the bride and groom. Mark appeared at that moment, handsome in his tuxedo, wondering why his bride was standing in the church entrance looking like she'd seen a ghost. His eyes took in the scene quickly. Rachel's pale face, David in his perfect little suit holding my hand, the manila envelope in my hand, and the circle of guests who were all staring at us with the kind of fascination reserved for car accidents and reality television. "What's going on?" he asked, though I could see in his expression that he was already starting to understand. Rachel turned to him with desperate eyes. "Mark, make her leave. Make them both leave right now." But Mark was looking at the receipts, scattered around us, at the proof of my financial investment in his wedding day. He was a good man, Mark. Not always strong, not always willing to stand up to Rachel when she was being unreasonable, but fundamentally decent. And I could see the exact moment when he realized what I had done for him and what Rachel had tried to do to David. "Rachel," he said quietly, "Sarah paid for our wedding?" "Not all of it," she said quickly, as if minimizing my contribution would somehow make the situation less devastating to her position. "Most of it," I corrected. "Almost all of it, actually." Mark looked at David, who was still standing beside me in his beautiful little suit, still not entirely sure what was happening but understanding that he was at the center of it somehow. "You tried to disinvite David?" Mark asked Rachel, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. Disappointment, maybe, or recognition of something about his fiancée that he hadn't wanted to see clearly until this moment. "I was trying to make sure our wedding day was perfect," Rachel said, but her voice was small now, defensive rather than commanding. "By excluding family? By excluding a child who's been excited about this for months?" Mark knelt down so he was at David's eye level. "Hey, buddy, you look very handsome in that suit." David's face brightened immediately. "Thank you, Uncle Mark. Mom helped me practice walking slowly and sitting quietly for your wedding." Mark's jaw tightened, and when he stood up to look at Rachel again, I could see something had fundamentally shifted between them. "We need to talk," he told her. "Right now." They stepped away from the growing crowd of guests, but not far enough that I couldn't hear Rachel's frantic whispers about how this was supposed to be her special day, about how she had worked so hard to make everything perfect, about how I was ruining everything by making a scene. But the scene was already made. The truth was already out. And as I stood there in that beautiful church, holding my son's hand and surrounded by the flowers and decorations I had secretly bought, I realized that I wasn't ashamed of what I had done. I was proud of it. I was proud that I had fought for David's right to be included in his family's celebration. I was proud that I had exposed Rachel's selfishness for what it was. And I was proud that my son, who was still standing beside me in his perfect little suit, would learn that sometimes the people who love you will go to extraordinary lengths to make sure you know you belong. The wedding did go on that day, though. Not quite the way Rachel had planned. David sat in the front row with the rest of the family, quiet and respectful, just like he had practiced. And when Mark and Rachel exchanged vows, I caught my brother-in-law's eye and saw something there that looked like gratitude mixed with regret. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the beginning of what happened when someone tried to make my son feel unwelcome at an event I had paid for. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up with proof of who you really are and what you've really done. And sometimes that proof changes everything. The ceremony proceeded, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Rachel walked down the aisle with a smile that looked painted on, her eyes avoiding the front row where David sat between Mark's parents, his legs swinging slightly as he tried to contain his excitement. Every few minutes, he would catch my eye and give me a small thumbs up, proud that he was remembering to use his quiet voice and sit still. Mark's vows were heartfelt, but I noticed how his gaze kept drifting to David during the more emotional moments. When he spoke about family and commitment, about building a life together based on love and respect, his words seemed to carry extra weight. Rachel's vows were perfectly rehearsed, flowing like a speech she had memorized, but there was a brittleness to her delivery that hadn't been there during their practice sessions. After the ceremony, the reception unfolded in the hotel ballroom I had also quietly funded. The tables were decorated with the centerpieces I had selected. The band played music from the package I had purchased, and the open bar served drinks that my credit card had covered. Rachel moved through the crowd like a woman in a dream, accepting congratulations and compliments while clearly struggling to process what had happened just hours earlier. David was having the time of his life. He danced with Mark's mother, carefully, stepped on Mark's feet during a slow song, and charmed the other guests with his earnest questions about marriage and weddings. Several people commented on how well-behaved he was, how sweet it was to see such a young boy taking everything so seriously. "He's been looking forward to this for months," I told Mark's aunt when she mentioned how polite David was being. "He practiced his wedding behavior for weeks." The aunt looked confused. Rachel mentioned something about children not being invited. I was surprised when I saw him here. "Plans changed," I said simply. It was during the dinner service that Rachel finally approached me. She had changed from her ceremony dress into a shorter reception dress, and her makeup had been retouched, but she still looked like someone who had been through an ordeal. She slid into the empty chair beside me while David was off showing his dance moves to a group of amused cousins. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "I'm listening. What you did today was inappropriate. This was supposed to be my wedding day, and you turned it into a spectacle." I looked at her carefully. Even now, after everything that had happened, she was focused on her own embarrassment rather than the hurt she had tried to cause my son. "Rachel, I paid for this wedding. I paid for your dress fitting, your hair appointment, your makeup trial. I paid for the cake you're about to cut and the champagne you're about to toast with. And you tried to exclude my son because you thought he might be inconvenient. I was trying to make sure everything went smoothly. By hurting a child who loves his uncle and was excited to celebrate with his family?" Rachel's composure cracked slightly. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. Everyone was watching, Everyone had expectations. I couldn't risk anything going wrong. So you decided David was the risk factor. He's 8 years old, Sarah. 8-year-olds don't understand formal events. I gestured toward the dance floor where David was now teaching Mark's elderly grandfather how to do some complicated hand-clapping game. Both of them were laughing, and other guests had gathered around to watch the impromptu entertainment. Look at him, Rachel. Really look at him. He's not disrupting anything. He's adding joy to your celebration. He's making people smile. He's doing exactly what children do at weddings when they're allowed to be part of them. Rachel followed my gaze, and for a moment, I saw something soften in her expression. But it was quickly replaced by defensiveness again. That's not the point. The point is that this was my decision to make, and you went behind my back to manipulate the situation. I didn't manipulate anything. I told the truth. I showed proof of what I had contributed to this wedding, and I made it clear that my son had every right to be here. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You humiliated yourself by trying to exclude a child from a family celebration that he had every right to attend. Rachel stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with something. Finally, she spoke again, her voice smaller than before. Mark is furious with me. Mark loves David. Of course he's upset that you tried to keep him away. But he doesn't understand. This wedding had to be perfect. Everything had to go exactly right. Why, Rachel? Why did it have to be perfect at the expense of including people who love you? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched David, who was now helping Mark's grandmother find her way back to her table, his small hand gently guiding her elbow. I don't know, she said finally. I just wanted everything to be beautiful. It is beautiful, I told her. Look around. Your wedding is beautiful. The flowers are gorgeous. The music is perfect. The food is delicious. But you know what's making it truly special? The people who are here to celebrate with you. The family. Members who drove hours to be here. The friends who took time off work. The 8-year-old boy who practiced sitting still because he wanted to honor your special day. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. I can't undo what I did. No, you can't. But you can choose how you move forward. She looked at me questioningly. You can choose to see David as part of your new family. You can choose to appreciate that he was excited to be here, that he wanted to celebrate with you and Mark. You can choose to let go of the idea that love and joy are somehow disruptive to perfect moments. Rachel was quiet for a long time, watching David as he now helped the photographer gather people for group photos, his serious little face focused on making sure everyone was in the right place. He really did practice for this, didn't he? She asked. Every day for 2 weeks. He wanted to make sure he didn't do anything wrong. And I made him think he was wrong just for existing. Yes, you did. Rachel flinched at my directness, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stood up slowly, smoothing down her dress. I need to go find him, she said. I watched as Rachel walked across the ballroom toward David, who was now sitting with Mark's parents, carefully eating his slice of wedding cake with a fork that looked too big for his small hands. When Rachel approached, he looked up with the cautious politeness that children reserve for adults they're not sure about. David, Rachel said, kneeling down beside his chair, I owe you an apology. David's eyes widened slightly. Adults didn't usually apologize to him. I was wrong to suggest that you shouldn't be here today. This is your family's celebration, and you belong here just as much as anyone else. David considered this seriously. It's okay, he said finally. Uncle Mark said you were just nervous about the wedding being perfect. I was nervous, Rachel admitted. But that's not an excuse for making you feel unwelcome. You've been wonderful today. You've been exactly the kind of guest that makes a wedding special. David's face brightened. Really? Really? And I'm sorry I didn't see that before. David nodded solemnly, then brightened again. Do you want to see my dance moves? Uncle Mark's grandfather taught me a new one. Rachel laughed, a real laugh this time, not the performative one she had been using all day. I would love to see your dance moves. As the evening wound down, I found myself sitting with Mark on the hotel balcony, watching the guests slowly filter out of the ballroom. David had finally crashed, falling asleep on a chair with his head pillowed on his arms, his tie loosened and his hair mussed from all the dancing. "Thank you," Mark said quietly. "For everything. For paying for the wedding, for bringing David, for making Rachel see what she was doing. You don't need to thank me for bringing my son to his uncle's wedding. But I do need to thank you for showing me who I'm marrying." I looked at him carefully. "Mark, what happened today doesn't have to define your marriage. People can change. Rachel can learn from this." Can she, though? Or is this who she really is when she's stressed or threatened? I didn't have an answer for that. Only time would tell whether Rachel's apology to David was genuine growth or damage control. "She paid you back, you know," Mark said after a moment. "She went to the bank this afternoon and had them wire the money to your account, all of it." I was surprised. She didn't have to do that. She said she couldn't live with herself knowing that you had paid for a wedding where your son wasn't welcome. "And what did you say?" I told her that the money wasn't the point. The point was that she was willing to hurt a child to protect her perfect day. Mark looked exhausted, and I realized that this wedding day had been as much of a revelation for him as it had been for Rachel. He had seen a side of his new wife that he hadn't fully recognized before, and now he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. David handled all of this better than any of the adults, Mark observed. Children are resilient. They forgive quickly when they feel safe again. He's lucky to have you as his mother. I'm lucky to have him as my son. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of the city twinkle below us. Inside the ballroom, the cleaning crew was already starting to break down the decorations, packing away the flowers and folding up the tables that had held so much tension and joy and revelation over the course of one long day. "What happens now?" Mark asked. "Now you go on your honeymoon. You start your marriage. You figure out how to build a life together that includes all the people you love." "And David?" "David goes back to being an 8-year-old boy who got to see his uncle get married. Who learned that sometimes adults make mistakes, but they can also make things right. Who learned that he has people in his life who will fight for him when he needs it." Mark nodded slowly. "I want to be one of those people. You already are." The next morning, as David and I were packing our bags to head home, there was a knock at our hotel room door. When I opened it, Rachel was standing there in jeans and a sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. "I wanted to say goodbye," she said, "and to thank you." "Thank me?" "For not letting me make the biggest mistake of my marriage on my wedding day. For showing me that being perfect isn't as important as being kind." David appeared at my side, still in his pajamas but wide awake. "Are you leaving for your honeymoon today?" he asked Rachel. "We are. We're going to Hawaii." "That sounds fun. Will you bring me back a souvenir?" Rachel smiled, a real smile, this time. "I will bring you back the best souvenir I can find." "Cool. Have a good trip." David wandered back into the room, already focused on finding his favorite toy for the car ride home. Rachel watched him go, then turned back to me. "I've never been around children much," she said. "I didn't know how to act around him. Children aren't that complicated. They just want to feel included and loved. I know that now. I'm going to do better." "We all make mistakes, Rachel. The important thing is learning from them." She nodded, then surprised me by reaching out to squeeze my hand. "Thank you for paying for the wedding, and thank you for bringing David. He made it better, not worse. I'm glad you can see that now. I can see a lot of things more clearly now." As Rachel walked away down the hotel corridor, I felt something settle in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace. David would have other family events, other celebrations, other moments where he needed someone to stand up for, his right to be included. And now he knew that he had people who would do that for him. More importantly, he had learned that he was worth fighting for, that his presence brought joy, not disruption, that being a child wasn't something to apologize for, but something to celebrate. When we got home that afternoon, David carefully hung his wedding suit in his closet, smoothing out the jacket and pants with the same attention he had given to getting dressed that morning. "Mom," he said as he closed the closet door, "I'm glad. We went to Uncle Mark's wedding." "Me too, sweetheart." Even though it was complicated, I smiled at his choice of words, especially because it was complicated. Sometimes the most important things we do are complicated. Like standing up for people? Exactly like standing up for people. David nodded seriously, processing this lesson in the way children do, filing it away for future use. Then he brightened again, the resilience of childhood taking over. "Can we get ice cream to celebrate?" "Absolutely." As we walked to the ice cream shop down the street, David chattering about his favorite parts of the wedding, I realized that this story wasn't really about a wedding at all. It was about family, about belonging, about the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. It was about a little boy who deserved to be celebrated, not hidden away. And it was about the adults who learned, sometimes the hard way, that love isn't about perfection. It's about inclusion, acceptance, and the willingness to make room for everyone at the table. The wedding receipts were paid back, but the real payment was something much more valuable. It was the knowledge that David would never again have to wonder if he was wanted at family celebrations. It was the understanding that his voice mattered, his presence was a gift, and his family would fight for him when he needed it. And sometimes, that's worth more than any perfect wedding day could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.